The Well of Living Water. In the heat-shimmering heart of Samaria, nestled in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, lay the village of Sychar. And in Sychar lived a woman named Photina. Her life was measured by two things: the weight of the water jug on her shoulder and the weight of the shame in her heart. She always went to the well at midday. The other women of the village went in the cool of the morning, their laughter and gossip a flowing stream of community from which she was excluded. But Photina went when the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, when the dusty streets were empty, and the only sounds were the buzzing of flies and the lonely slap of her own sandals on the baked earth. The midday heat was her shield, a cloak of scorching air that guaranteed solitude. Solitude was a painful comfort, for it was in the silence that the whispers of her past grew loudest. 5 husbands. The words were a brand on her soul, not a widow 5 times over, which would have earned her pity, but a woman passed from one man to another, each union a new crack in her already fractured spirit. And the man she lived with now, he had not even bothered to make her his wife. In the eyes of the village, she was a broken vessel, used and discarded, her reputation as cracked and dry as the riverbed in a drought. Every averted gaze in the marketplace, every mother who pulled her child a little closer as she passed, was another stone cast. So she walked her lonely path to Jacob's well, an ancient stone cistern that had quenched the thirst of patriarchs. The journey was her penance, the heavy jug her burden. As she approached, she saw a figure sitting by the wellhead. This was unusual. No one came to the well at this hour. As she drew closer, her steps slowed. He was a Jew. She could tell by the cut of his clothes and the tassels on his shawl. Her heart tightened. A Jew? Here, in the heart of Samaria? It was not just unusual, it was unheard of. Jews despised Samaritans, viewing them as half-breeds with a corrupted faith. They would walk miles out of their way to avoid setting foot on this land. For a Jewish man to be here was strange. For him to be alone at this well at this hour was impossible. Her first instinct was to turn back, to endure her thirst rather than face the inevitable scorn. But the jug was heavy and her throat was parched. With her head down, avoiding his gaze, she walked to the other side of the well and began to unloop the rope for her bucket. The silence stretched, thick and hot. She expected him to rise and leave, disgusted by her presence. Instead, he spoke. "Will you give me a drink?" The words were so simple, so unexpected, they startled her. She froze, her hand on the rope, and slowly looked up at him. He was a man, perhaps a few years older than her, with dust on his feet and weariness in his face. But his eyes were not what she expected. There was no contempt in them, no judgment. There was only a calm, patient kindness that seemed to look past her scandalous reputation and see only a person. "You are a Jew," she said, her voice raspy from surprise and disuse. "And I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" She couldn't keep the sharp edge of a lifetime of resentment out of her tone. Jews do not associate with Samaritans. The man smiled gently, a smile that reached his eyes. "If you knew the gift of God," he replied, his voice calm and clear, "and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Photina stared at him, confused. The words were lyrical, strange. "Living water?" she scoffed, falling back on her practiced defensiveness. "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock?" The man's gaze did not waver. "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again," he said, gesturing to the stone well. "But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water, welling up to eternal life." His words bypassed her cynical mind and spoke to a deeper place within her, to a thirst she had carried for years that no amount of water from Jacob's well could ever quench. It was the thirst for acceptance, for peace, for a clean slate. A part of her wanted to mock him, to call him a madman, but another, deeper part, a part she thought had long since withered and died, leaned forward with a desperate hope. "Sir," she said, her voice now barely a whisper, "give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." She meant the well, but in her heart, she meant the lonely, shameful journey she made every day of her life. The man's kind eyes held hers. His next words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. "Go, call your husband and come back." The blood drained from Photina's face. The shield of anonymity she had hidden behind was shattered. He had found her wound, the source of her shame. The conversation had turned from strange philosophy to the brutal reality of her life. She looked at the ground, unable to meet his gaze. "I have no husband," she mumbled, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was a half-truth, an evasion. "You are right when you say you have no husband," the man replied, his voice still gentle, but now filled with a knowing that stripped her soul bare. "The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." It was not an accusation. He did not say it with the condemning tone of the village elders or the sneering judgment of the other women. He stated it as a fact, a simple, non-judgmental acknowledgement of her broken life. And in that lack of condemnation, something miraculous happened. Photina did not feel shame. For the first time, she felt seen. This man saw the entirety of her messy, sinful life, and he was still talking to her. He was still offering her water. Stunned, her mind racing to comprehend who this person could be, she deflected. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling with awe, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain." She gestured toward Mount Gerizim. "But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." It was a genuine question, an ancient argument between their peoples, but it was also a shield. She wanted to keep him talking, to understand how he could know her secrets. Jesus looked past her, toward the 2 mountains that framed the valley. "Woman," he said, and the way he said it gave her a dignity she had never felt. "Believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. A time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." He was tearing down the very walls that had divided their people for centuries. He was saying that what mattered wasn't the place, but the heart. That God wasn't confined to a temple in Jerusalem or a shrine on Gerizim, but was seeking a real, honest connection. Photina was breathless. Her whole world, built on rules and divisions and shame, was being dismantled by the stranger's words. "I know that Messiah is coming," she said, voicing the deepest hope of her people. "When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Jesus looked at her, his gaze direct and profound. And then he spoke the words that would echo in her heart for the rest of her life. "I "The one speaking to you, I am he." At that very moment, his disciples returned from the village with food. They stopped dead in their tracks, shocked to see him not only speaking to a Samaritan, but to this woman whose reputation was surely known to them. They said nothing, but their disapproval was a palpable wave of judgment. But Photina barely noticed them. She was looking at Jesus, the Messiah, who had seen her shame and offered her honor, who knew her thirst and offered her a never-ending spring. In that instant, she forgot her water jug. She forgot the reason she had come, the heavy burden she had carried for so long. Leaving the jug, the symbol of her old life, sitting by the well, she turned and ran back toward the village. She ran, not with her head down in shame, but with her head held high, her feet flying over the ground she had so often walked in disgrace. She did not run to her home to hide. She ran straight into the marketplace, the very place she always avoided, the place where the judging eyes were harshest. "Come!" she cried out, her voice ringing with the joy and authority no one had ever heard from her. "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" Her transformation was so absolute, so shocking, that the villagers stopped what they were doing and stared. This was not the broken, silent Photina they knew. This was a woman radiant with a newfound purpose. Her testimony, coming from a source they had long since dismissed, was so compellingly strange that they had to see for themselves. A crowd began to form, and moved by her astonishing testimony, they followed her out of the village and down the dusty road to Jacob's well. There they found Jesus, waiting patiently. They invited him to stay, and he remained with them for 2 days, teaching them as he had taught Photina. Many came to believe because of his words, but it began with her. Her private conversation became a public revival. She, the outcast, had become the first evangelist to her people. She had gone to the well that day, seeking water to quench a physical thirst, burdened by a lifetime of shame. She returned with a spring of living water bubbling up inside her, a woman no longer defined by her past, but by the one who had met her there and offered her a new beginning. The 2 days that followed were like a dream for the village of Sychar. The man they had been taught to hate as a Jew, they now welcomed as a prophet. Jesus did not stay in the home of the village elder or the wealthiest merchant. He shared meals in the simple homes of farmers and potters, and he taught not in a synagogue, but in the open air of the marketplace and in the cool shade of the sycamore trees. And everywhere he went, Photina was nearby. At first, she lingered at the edge of the crowds, a lifetime of shame still whispering that she did not belong. But the villagers, their hearts opened by Jesus' words, now looked at her differently. They saw not the broken woman of Sychar, but the courageous one who had brought the Messiah to them. The women who once shunned her now made space for her to sit. The men who had judged her now listened to her questions. Her presence was no longer a scandal, but a testament. She watched Jesus' disciples, particularly the fiery one called Peter and the thoughtful one named John. She saw their confusion warring with their loyalty. They were good men, but they were still bound by the old rules. They ate the food offered by the Samaritans, but with a hesitation that spoke volumes. They listened to their master teach, but their eyes would occasionally dart around as if they still couldn't quite believe they were in this forbidden land. On the evening of the second day, as Jesus spoke to a large gathering near the well, Photina saw John standing apart, looking at the faces in the crowd. She felt a quiet confidence she had never known, a peace that flowed from the living water within her, and she approached him. "You find it strange, don't you?" she asked, her voice gentle. John was startled, but he did not deny it. "Our teachers have always taught us that salvation is for the Jews," he admitted, his gaze sweeping over the Samaritan faces, "that this is a land God has passed over." "And what do you see now?" Fotina asked, her own eyes following his. "Do you see Samaritans, or do you see men and women thirsting for God?" John looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw no trace of the hard, defensive woman she had been. Her face was open, serene. "He told you everything about your life," he said, repeating the words he had heard. Fotina nodded, a soft smile on her lips. "Yes, the men of my past, they all told me what I was, a possession to be used, a disgrace to be hidden. They defined me by my sin. But your master, he told me everything I ever did, not to condemn me, but to show me that he knew me completely and still offered me a gift. The others saw only my thirst. He saw the wellspring that could be." John was silent, contemplating her words. He was beginning to understand that the kingdom his master spoke of had no walls, no borders between Judea and Samaria. The morning of their departure, the entire village came to see them off. "We no longer believe just because of what you said," one of the elders told Fotina, placing a respectful hand on her shoulder. "Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." As Jesus prepared to leave, he turned to Fotina one last time. He did not give her a command, but an affirmation. "The well your father Jacob gave you can sustain a village," he said, his eyes full of meaning. "But the water I have given you can sustain a nation. Do not let the spring run dry." In the weeks and months that followed, Sychar was transformed. The ancient arguments with their Jewish neighbors seemed petty and small. A new spirit of forgiveness and hope settled over the village, and at the center of it all was Fotina. She did not become a preacher who shouted from the rooftops. Instead, her life became her sermon. The well, once her place of lonely shame, became her sanctuary. She began going in the cool of the morning with the other women. At first, the conversations were stilted, but soon they began to ask her questions. They asked her to retell the story, to explain what Jesus meant by living water or worshiping in truth. She spoke not as one who was perfect, but as one who was perfectly loved. Her past was not a secret to be hidden, but a testament to the depth of the grace she had received. She spoke of her own brokenness with an honesty that gave the other women the courage to speak of theirs. The Well of Jacob, a place of gossip and social ritual, slowly became a place of genuine fellowship and shared faith. News of the Samaritan revival eventually trickled back to Jerusalem, where it was met with outrage by the religious authorities. They sent emissaries to investigate, men who came with scowls and accusations, dismissing the events as heresy and blasphemy. They tried to intimidate the villagers and discredit Fotina, reminding everyone of her sinful past. But their threats had no power. The people of Sychar had not just heard about God, they had met him. And Fotina, who had once crumbled under the weight of a single judgmental glance, now stood firm. "You see only my past," she told the furious Pharisees in the marketplace. "You see a Samaritan, a woman, a sinner. But the Messiah saw a child of God who was thirsty. You offer rules that parch the soul. He offers a love that quenches it forever. Who do you think we will follow?" Her courage, born not of pride, but of a deep, abiding peace, silenced them. They left in a rage, but they left defeated. Fotina lived a long life. She never saw Jesus again in the flesh, but she walked with him every day. The spring of water he had placed within her never ceased to flow, bringing life to her family, her village, and to all who came to hear the story of the woman who went to a well seeking water and found the ocean of God's love. She was no longer Photina of Sychar, the woman with 5 husbands. She was Photina, the apostle to Samaria, the first person to carry the news of the Messiah beyond the borders of his own people, a living testament that God's grace is for everyone who thirsts. Years passed. The dust of Sychar settled into a new pattern. The children who had been toddlers when Jesus visited were now young men and women who grew up hearing the story of the Messiah and the well. The community of believers, born from Photina's testimony, was no longer a curious sect, but the quiet, beating heart of the village. They met not in a grand building, but in homes and olive groves. Their worship defined not by a mountain or a temple, but by the spirit and truth Jesus had spoken of. Photina was now a woman whose age showed not as weariness, but as a deep, gentle wisdom. The sharp edges of her past had been worn smooth, not by time, but by grace. She was a leader, a matriarch of the faith, looked to for counsel and comfort. The wellspring within her had indeed nourished her people. Then news began to arrive from the south, carried by merchants and travelers on the trade routes. It was disturbing news from Judea. A young deacon named Stephen, full of fervor and truth, had been stoned to death by the religious council. A zealous Pharisee named Saul of Tarsus was now breathing out threats and murder, dragging believers from their homes, scattering the fledgling church like seeds on the wind. One sweltering afternoon, a small, desperate group appeared on the road to Sychar. They were not merchants, they were refugees. Men, women, and a few children, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, their clothes tattered from a hurried flight. They were Jews. An old, familiar tension coiled in the air. The villagers stopped and watched them, the ancient suspicion between Jew and Samaritan rising like a ghost from its grave. But Photina, seeing them from the marketplace, felt no suspicion. She saw only thirsty people. She walked out to meet them, her steps calm and purposeful. The leader of the group, a man named Benjamin, looked at her with distrust. "We seek only safe passage," he said, his voice strained. "We will not trouble your village." "Trouble?" Photina replied, her voice kind. "You are not trouble. You are travelers, and you are weary. Our master taught us to welcome the stranger." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "Your master? What would a Samaritan know of the master, Jesus of Nazareth?" To him, Jesus was a Jewish Messiah for the Jewish people. "He is the one who told me everything I ever did. He is the one who sat at our well and told us that the time for worship on separate mountains was over. In this village, we are not Samaritans or Jews. We are simply followers of the way." The refugees were stunned into silence. They had fled from their own people for believing in Jesus, only to find that same belief in the most unlikely of places. Exhausted and with nowhere else to go, they cautiously accepted Photina's offer of water, food, and shelter. The first few days were tense. The Jewish believers, led by Benjamin, prayed separately. They were grateful for the charity, but they could not bring themselves to share a full meal or worship with those they still considered unclean. They saw the Samaritans' faith as a pale, flawed imitation of their own. Photina did not force them. Instead, she led her people by example. She instructed her community to serve their guests with a love that asked for nothing in return. They brought the best of their bread, their olives, and their goat's milk. They tended to the refugees' injuries and listened to their harrowing stories of persecution without judgment. One evening, Benjamin sought Photina out as she sat by Jacob's well, the place where her own life had been transformed. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice thick with a confusion that wrestled with his prejudice. "We have despised your people for generations. We have called you heretics. We would have never done the same for you." Photina looked into the deep, cool darkness of the well. "Years ago, I came to this spot believing I was worthless," she said, her voice soft. "I was defined by my sins, my past, and by the name my people and yours had given me. But the Messiah met me here, and he gave me a new name, Beloved. He did not see a Samaritan woman, he saw a soul that was thirsty. The water he gave me was grace, Benjamin. Grace is not a cup you can earn, it is a spring you receive. How can I, who have received so much, offer anyone else a drink from a smaller cup?" Her words disarmed him. He saw in her not a heretic, but a reflection of the very master he followed, a grace that shattered rules and healed ancient wounds. The next day, a miracle happened in Sychar, one quieter than the healing of a leper, but no less profound. Benjamin and his small group of Jewish believers came to the olive grove where the Samaritans were worshiping, and for the first time, they knelt and prayed together. They shared one loaf of bread. In a dusty village in a despised land, the wall of hostility, centuries old, crumbled into dust. Their timing was providential. Not long after, a new visitor arrived in Sychar, a deacon named Philip, one of the 7 chosen alongside Stephen, who had also fled the persecution in Jerusalem. He came to preach the good news. Expecting to find a hostile and ignorant land, instead, he found a thriving, unified community of Jewish and Samaritan believers, a sanctuary of faith in a world on fire. Sychar became a vital refuge, a hub from which the message of Jesus could spread north, east, and west. Years later, when the apostles Peter and John came down from Jerusalem to see the work for themselves, they were astonished. They laid hands on the Samaritan believers and they received the Holy Spirit, an undeniable sign from God that the promise was for them too. It was the fulfillment of everything Jesus had told Photina at the well. Photina, now an old woman with silver hair and eyes that held the deep peace of the well, watched it all. She had not been called to be an apostle in Jerusalem or a preacher in Rome. Her calling had been to stay, to tend the spring that had sprung up in her own heart and in her own village. She learned the final, greatest lesson of the living water. It is not a private pond meant to be hoarded. It is a current that finds its true purpose when it flows out, merging with other streams, joining a great and mighty river of grace that can and will change the course of the world.